Emotions are still raw after last week's Half Moon Bay and Monterey Park shootings. A lot of people trying to process their feelings about those tragedies that left 18 people dead across California.
As families work to cope with the feelings of grief and frustration, we're turning to the experts to help us make sense of it all. Joining us live here during KRON 4 News at 6 is mental health advocate Dr. Ruth White. Dr. Ruth, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you again, Justine and Ken, for having me.
Can you help us make sense of it all?
Well, I don't know if I can make sense of it all. I can say that it's hard for people to have all these emotions that have been happening, especially since the beginning of the year, where there's been a lot of shootings, as we know, like almost every day. And then, of course, the latest police brutality that has been caught on camera, and then the response to that. And I think all of these things happening at one time can make people feel overwhelmed, and for a lot of people it's just a lot and they want to tune out, and yet the human instinct is still, we're always wanting to watch that accident happen, and so we're sort of drawn to this negative thing, even though it's not the healthiest thing for us to keep watching.
Yeah, it's hard for everyone, the people who are involved in the story, the viewers. It's hard for us. We don't like telling these stories either. So that thing where you want to turn away and tune out makes total sense. Is that wise?
It is, because sometimes I always tell people you can read the news, but looking at the actual incidents that happen and listening to people talk about their trauma is traumatizing for people. And that's why it's called secondary trauma, or what we call vicarious trauma. So you watching somebody suffer, or you're hearing somebody talking about their suffering, can always bring on feelings of this, almost like the same feelings that you would have if you were experiencing, obviously not exactly the same. And that's why that term doom scrolling, right, where people just go down the rabbit hole and they keep watching videos and they hear people telling their stories, and then they watch that. They might see a thing in the newspaper with like everybody's picture who died. You might see that on Twitter. Then you turn to your Facebook page, and if you're news outlets, they're sending it to your email. So what I often tell people is just, you can hear about it, but limit your exposure. So knowing it happens is enough. You don't really need to watch somebody die, or watch somebody get shot or get hurt, or watch a mom cry over her dead child through a school shooting.
And is there
It's hard, but we need to protect ourselves.
Sure.
Yeah, there has to be a point where you can put up a limit on what you can expose yourself to. I just wonder how to talk to younger kids about it, kids, age 6 to even 16 years old, how you can help them kind of go through the emotions of knowing that like scary things are happening out there.
I think what's also important is also to protect your children. Like, a 15-year-old is much different from a 7-year-old. Like, I don't think in today's world that 7-year-olds should necessarily be watching the news, because it's very hard for them to know what is relevant to them. Is my family safe? They hear about school shootings. A lot of kids have anxiety then about going to school, and nothing really that your parent says is going to make you feel better. So there needs to be some kind of understanding of where children are at and what's appropriate for them to hear, as well as to understand. And so if a child does hear about it, it's really important for parents to say that they're doing their best to keep them safe, and to actually talk about concrete things that maybe their school is doing. That said, if your child is going to be exposed to a lot of this, it might be hard for you, for that child not to feel anxious, because they're having all this input and they're not at the age where they know how to contextualize what is happening. Even though some adults are also feeling that, anxiety, like, I can't go anywhere and I might get shot. Again, I often say to people, and some of my friends get annoyed when I say this, it's also important to understand how rare it is, even though it sounds like it's always happening. Yes, it's always happening, but it's highly unlikely that it's going to happen to you.
So what's your advice for those of us who feel like we've seen too much? We know we're hurting, we're traumatized, even though it doesn't directly affect us. Just knowing that this happened is painful. What's your advice to maybe take a break, and what should we do? What should we do to kind of start healing ourselves a little bit?
Well, it's important to know that there's a saying in psychology that it takes 4 positive experiences to counteract a negative one. So we're hardwired to focus on the negative. So it's really important to be consciously and intently seeking positive experiences to counteract that. So do things that you enjoy. For me, it's going for a walk. For some people, it's exercise. Any mindful practice, whether it's a creative thing like crocheting or knitting or drawing or something that makes you happy and gives you joy, and find ways to express that as much as possible. Also, for a lot of people, journaling helps because it's a place to put that emotion at the end of a day or even at any time that you're experiencing it. And then I also say to people, and I mean, Oprah made this really famous, is about a gratitude practice because it makes you again focus on what went well, what am I happy for, what is good in my life, and that's a counteract to that. And then again, I say to people who are having like a really hard time sleeping or anxiety and it's not going away, to either call that 988 crisis hotline number where there's always somebody at the end of that line, and that number is national, as well as seeking out a professional if you're feeling like you can't really cope, especially if it's impacting your work or your relationships.
Dr. Ruth, thank you so much for joining us here. We appreciate your advice, and a good journaling helps a lot sometimes, just gets it out from the head onto the paper.
Playing with the pets too, because they can always use attention, and they always bring you up. They bring you up.
And actually pets are used as therapy for people. So if you do have a pet, hang out with your pet as much as possible.
All right, great advice. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.